Blessings to you all. The other night was a Q&A session, but due to unforeseen circumstances, we didn't make it. So we'll do it tonight, because there's a few questions that have come in, and they may be of use if we listen to the questions and talk about the answers. There may be some Dhamma in there somewhere that can be helpful. So, first question. From the Dhamma talk on the 28th of August, Ajahn told us about the wrong views about self and gave the example of the body by seeing the impermanence of hair. Please give examples how to notice or contemplate the mind as not self. How to see consciousness is not self. Please explain and give examples. Well, the simplest answer is the Buddha said the mind is not self. That'll do for me, because I think the Buddha was very wise and knew what he was talking about. But I don't think the Buddha would have praised just believing what he said. I think he would have encouraged us to investigate and get to know for ourselves. But you start with that teaching. All Dhamma, we just chanted it, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta, all Dhammas, meaning all phenomena, are not self. What are phenomena? Well, physical or material phenomena and mental phenomena. That's what makes up this world. It's the material world, the physical body of a human being or any other animal, and then the mental part of our person, what we call Nama Dhamma. There's Rupa Dhamma, physical, Nama Dhamma, mental. And how do we know Nama Dhamma? Well, the Buddha said, well, look into these different areas. He already gave us clues, keys to look at our experience. Nama Dhamma is made up of Vedana, feelings, the feeling tone of each moment of experience. So it could be pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So who experiences or knows feeling? Well, the mind knows feeling, so the feeling arises with consciousness. Sanya is perception or memory sometimes. That arises with every moment of consciousness. Mental formations or volitions arise with every moment. Consciousness, good and bad volitions. And sense consciousness is arising from moment to moment. We have our 5 senses. So how does consciousness arise? Well, literally, eyes, healthy eye, there's light, and you pay attention to your eyes, eye consciousness arises. So what is the cause for consciousness to arise when you're seeing? Well, it's just those factors. Healthy eyes, light, something is to be seen. So you have eyes consciousness. Could be hearing consciousness, tasting, touching, smelling consciousness, depending on the conditions. And that's going on all the time. These moments of sense consciousness are we say vibhaka karma, old karma coming back to us every moment. What you're seeing, hearing, tasting, this is based on different conditions, we say dependently arisen, and that is your karma coming back to you all the time. So how come consciousness is not self? Well, because it's dependently arisen, ultimately you can't find anything that you could say is a self in there. Usually we define self as something that's substantial, lasting, unchanging maybe. It's usually how we look at as a self, something that's kind of there all the time, unchanging. Whereas, as I've just explained, consciousness arises from moment to moment based on contact. But prior to that, even if you look at the teaching of Patheticism, what is the cause for consciousness to arise? Well, it's karma, good and bad karma. We say avijja paccaya sankhara. So ignorance leads to karmic formations. Sankhara paccaya vijnana. Consciousness arises from moment to moment based on karma. So as I said, consciousness arises, it's old karma really. And where does old karma come from? From ignorance. With ignorance and all these other factors working together, you get a sense of self. And this sense of self will keep making karma as long as it's not revealed, exposed as a delusion and as a cause of suffering, something to be abandoned. We'll keep doing it. So literally, consciousness is not self because it arises dependent on certain conditions, causes and conditions. Keep consciousness going, and it's arising and passing away all the time, from moment to moment. It's so fast that we don't notice. We don't notice the breaks. And so we get this delusion that there's a sort of a continuous self. I'm seeing, I'm knowing, I'm thinking, I'm hearing, tasting. Even though these are specific moments of consciousness, awareness, knowing, experience, we take it as a continuous sense of self. And the Buddha pointed out, you're not one consciousness that's experiencing all these things. These are individual moments of consciousness arising and ceasing. But because of avijja, ignorance, we stick a label on, this is me, myself. And we keep attaching to that label rather than seeing that consciousness is arising and ceasing and that there is no solid self there. We just go with the label, so we're actually holding on to a delusion willingly. And the Buddhist teachings are helping us to investigate that, see, well, is that the correct thing to do, to stick with this label, me, mine, myself? And as you expose that as a delusion, you also realize it's a cause of great suffering. Because with the arising of consciousness, it's the specific condition for nama rupa to arise. Consciousness and nama rupa are kind of feeding each other the whole time. Nama rupa leads to more consciousness. Consciousness is supporting the arising of nama rupa. You remove consciousness, what's that? Well, from this set of nama rupa, it means death. What happens at death? Well, consciousness is gone. So, like the Buddha just said, the body, when you die, the body becomes like a rotten log. Rotten logs don't have consciousness. They don't feel, they don't perceive, know, think. They're just rotten logs. We've got a lot of them in the forest here, and I can guarantee that's what they're like. Not much good for anything, maybe firewood if they're not too rotten. They're good for mulch in the forest, perhaps, and they give a lot of other little bugs a place to live. But they don't have consciousness. So when someone dies, consciousness is gone, so nama rupa breaks apart. That's what death is. It's the permanent separation of consciousness and nama rupa. So that whole little system stops, except because of karma, avijja paccaya sankhara, because we're still attaching to the delusion of self and making karma, consciousness arises again. but no longer with this set of nama-rupa. And that's become the rotten log, so it will look for something else, some other place to arise, depending on karma. So that's why you get the teaching of rebirth. So you may find someone is reborn as a human or an animal. You can see where consciousness has arisen, if you had the eyes to see. Of course, most people don't. We're just talking theoretically here. Or it may be born into a subtle body of a deva or a brahma, which is still consciousness linked to nama-rupa, but just in its next life. So one difficulty in contemplating consciousness as not self is we can't see all this arising and ceasing very easily because it's so fast and so tricky and so deluding. And the Buddha actually said it would probably be wiser or more correct to take the body as a self, because at least you have that for a lifetime, however long you live, 10 years, 50 years, 80 years. You know, you could say, well, this body is me. The Buddha actually said body is not you, it's not self, but it would be in a way more logical to take it as a self, because it's something solid and it's around, even though it is always changing. It's not really very logical to take mind as self, because the mind is changing literally from moment to moment, arising and ceasing. Consciousness is arising and ceasing. So if you could see that, you'd have to admit, oh, there's no self in something that's just arising and ceasing. Individual moments. Even one moment of consciousness, they break down into sub-moments in the Abhidhamma. 17 sub-moments. So it's like ever briefer moments of, you know, you could take one moment of consciousness as yourself, okay, and then you break that down into 17. So you've got 17 little selves there. How can you see that? Well, they suggest just observe when you're waking up in the morning. And you're in that deep, dark, quiet place maybe. And then there's something that triggers awakening, whether it's a sound or a feeling in the body or just the emerging of a new awareness, bringing you to wakefulness, waking up in the morning. But there's that sort of burst from the place where they usually call bhavanga, deep state of sleep, to the place of full consciousness, full awareness. You know, there's that sort of slight sense of emerging. There's these moments, individual little moments, sort of kicking in, a bit like starting. When I was a kid and the car wouldn't start, you had a little handle. You turn the handle to get it going, the crankshaft, whatever it is, and it's a bit like that. Your mind is kicking in. It's like 17 moments. So sometimes it's from a loud noise, isn't it? There's a loud noise and you're like pulled from this dark place and suddenly you're awake. You might not know what the loud noise was that woke you up, but there's this sudden shock of being awake. And those are all individual moments of consciousness. Even sleep is individual moments of consciousness, but it's deep sleep. So where's the self in that? You say, well, I was asleep. Well, you can say anything, can't you? But deep sleep, there's no awareness, and then there's a burst of semi-awareness, and that's why we get dreams, and then there's full awareness. But if you go off and start drinking or something, or maybe you go back into a state of semi-consciousness, even when you've got full awareness, you can change that awareness, that state of consciousness. Many people find the easiest way into seeing not self in the mind, consciousness, is to contemplate impermanence, just like the body. So, in Satipatthana, the Buddha said, focus on the mind. And you can look at it like a vessel. And consciousness is like a vessel which keeps having new contents being put into it all the time. So we have different mental states. Greed, non-greed, anger, non-anger, delusion, non-delusion, and then all these sort of offshoots. So your mood, your mental state, the thoughts, The feelings that your mind is experiencing are changing from moment to moment. Just contemplate today. How many different thoughts, feelings, mental states have you experienced since you got up until this moment? It's many, many thoughts, feelings, mental states. Some of them good, some of them more neutral, some of them positively bad or negatively bad, whatever way you want to call it. You can recall that, so you may not have been fully aware as your mind states were changing, but you can see that sense of linked states of consciousness. And when you meditate, as now we were meditating, maybe your mind experienced expanded state of consciousness. As you enter samadhi, they call that expanded consciousness. When your mind is full of stress and pain and anguish, it becomes very narrow and very focused on within itself on that suffering, very fixed and attached to that, because it's a very extreme state. When your mind is letting go and experiencing samadhi, you call it an expanded state. So in one meditation, you might have periods where you feel more peaceful and calm, different contents of the mind, and then you have other periods where you feel terrible or distracted or sleepy, so other contents of the mind. So the contents of this vessel are changing all the time. So you might say, well, that's all me, I know what's going on. But you don't, do you? If you're honest, you have to admit half the time you're not fully aware and you're missing stuff. But you can refer back and say, yeah, that's true, isn't it? I move through many different moods and mental states today. So this is why the Buddha encouraged practicing Sati, mindfulness. Mindfulness, you're paying attention to what's going on in body and mind, and that starts to reveal the truth in more detail to you. By paying attention carefully, you can examine the truth. Dhamma Anupassana, the fourth Satipatthana, is really the processes of the mind, how suffering arises, so what leads to what. So how do we get suffering? Well, we have avijja, paccaya, sankhara, we have all these links in the process of dependent origination. The specific causes and conditions that lead up to the experience of mental suffering, painful experiences, unpleasant thoughts, feelings, just as there's causes and conditions leading to more experience of pleasant mental states, skillful mental states. Ultimately, the only one who's free from all this is the Arahant. So how is the consciousness for the Arahant? Well, they can, while they're still alive, they still feel pleasure and pain, they still see and hear, they can still think. But they're different from the ordinary person because there's no more delusion of self, there's no more avijja, paccaya, sankhara. So the Arahant doesn't make karma. They're still experiencing results of their old karma, which is why they experience moments and moments of consciousness, but there's no longer a sense of self. That label is no longer stamped on top of it. They know things, but they don't cling or become or suffer, and there's no more causes for birth. So when they die, there's no more birth. So what happens to their consciousness when they die? Only the Arahant knows. We don't know. But you can see, well, there's no more birth, no more clinging, no more suffering, no more attachment, no more greed, anger, delusion. So there's just, knowing, I guess. Consciousness is just knowing, isn't it? But there's no self, there's no delusion. Half the time we're knowing, but knowing wrongly, so we create a self out of this consciousness that knows. And we keep adding on labels and then experience suffering, because whatever comes into our consciousness we take as a self. So if it's a unpleasant sight, sound, taste, smell, it tends to produce craving, clinging, suffering. You see something and it's not just seeing, it's I see that and I like it and I want it. Maybe you can't have it, or it doesn't last very long and you get annoyed, irritated, or you can't get it. Or it's something you don't like, so I don't want it, get rid of it. suffering. The Arahant doesn't have that anymore. They're seeing, but there's no clinging, no suffering. The consciousness acts just as a function of mind. We say it's just natural knowing of conditions, but there's no self grasping at it. So what is consciousness, what is mind? We say it's that which knows. It's the natural knowing. But then all this other stuff becomes the basis for attachment. The feeling, the perception, the sense consciousness, the data coming in through the senses. The untrained mind clings, so it creates, we construct our own self out of it all. We make suffering. The Arahant laughs because they say, well, you don't have to do that. You can be peaceful and happy. You have to train yourself not to make suffering out of your experience. Don't make a problem out of it. Don't make it a big personal problem. And you just contemplate times in your life when you've had a lot of suffering, say somebody really annoyed you, and then you're carrying that around. So that's a perception, a memory, and then one day you're walking along and you see them, and boom, anger, rage may come up in your mind. Really all that's happening is just seeing consciousnesses arising. You're seeing a form walking along the street towards you, and rage comes. Where does that come from? It comes from avijja paccaya sankhara, a lack of knowing, a lack of a full awareness. Means we grasp at the perception, the craving, the clinging, the thoughts. Maybe already as you walk towards them, you're already planning to say something. You've been planning to say it for days and weeks. You're going to say something to hurt them, get back at them. Worse than that, you're planning to murder them. That's all you adding on through ignorance. You add on to just seeing. Really, it's just seeing. So if it was the Arahant, they may have been hurt as well. The Arahants get hurt as well as we do. But it's just seeing. Oh, that guy. I mean, they may still make a few decisions based on seeing that guy, but they don't suffer. They don't suffer with desire for the things they like either. You know, the Arahant eats food, and it may be most delicious food, but it's just tasting, seeing, smelling, tasting, arising and ceasing. Consciousness is just consciousness arising and ceasing. There's no person grasping at that with a sense of self, saying, I like that, indulging or thinking a lot about it. They just eat and let go. So if you could see when someone dies, like people are always asking, what happens to consciousness when someone dies? Well, you could just see consciousness arising and passing away, couldn't you? If they go on, because they're not an Arahant, they go on to another birth. Well, it just depends on the karma where that birth will be. In heaven realm, Brahma realm, hell realm, animal realm, ghost realm, human realm. It's just consciousness takes on another life, another birth. But ultimately speaking, or on the deepest level, there's no person in that. But because of our perceptions are always creating stories, so people love to fantasize about their last life. Where were they? Oh, I must have been in this place or that place, based on your perceptions. If you had some good things in your life, you say, oh, I was probably in that really good place. I'm from heaven. Some people say that, I'm from heaven. You better listen to me because I know what heaven's like. Or when I was a kid growing up, everyone who could remember their past life was an Egyptian princess. So you started to doubt. You think, There must have been a lot of Egyptian princesses back in the time of the pharaohs, because there's so many people. Then I went to Thailand, and everyone who can remember past lives in Thailand was a Thai princess, married to Rama V. So there's one famous one who fell out of the boat on the river, Chao Phraya River, and everyone claimed to be her. And you start thinking, wow, how many princesses fell out of the boat on the river? You have to Google it and find out the story. But people have this fashionable past life recollections, aren't they? There's all perceptions and attachments, what we would have liked to have been if we could choose based on our current set of attachments. This sense of self is so sneaky. It creates a past, creates a future, rewrites history, prepares history for the next life. It's often the people, when they're dying, that's their kind of hope, is, people will remember me like this, like that. That's what the sense of self does. But really, what can you remember? Oh, consciousness arose and ceased. It's not very romantic. You couldn't write a whole book about that. Consciousness arose and ceased, bestseller. Doesn't work very well. So self likes to be interesting. Some people even create stories about their suffering and kind of play it up a bit because it sells well, don't you? You look anything, dramas and TVs and movies and novels, they have to have a little bit of stimulation in it, so the sense of self has to be played up. But really it's consciousness arising and passing away. Happy, sad, angry, bored, excited. It's the same in a meditation retreat. You go on a meditation retreat for 10 days and there's the happy day, excited, inspired. There's the boring day. There's the day of misery, everything's falling apart, no mindfulness. There's the day of desperation. Can I get out of here? Shall I leave the retreat early? Then the final day, you're happy. You think it's because you finally cracked it, but it's actually because you're expecting to go home. But what is it? It's just days of sense consciousness arising and passing away, depending on different conditions. So if you could keep your mind firm and stable, which is what mindfulness helps us do, it's almost like you're just watching the stories come and go, the different players, the different experiences, the different weather patterns of the mind, or the real weather patterns. But there's this knowing that's just seeing it all and understand that this is not self. Mind is not self. There's a very refined knowledge, so don't be disappointed if you get caught out by consciousness arising and passing away and you missed it, because really only anagamis practicing to be arahants are going to get it, and when they get it, they become arahants. We have to start somewhere, but it's a very refined training, which is why the Buddha started with mindfulness of the body. It's the easiest thing to see as impermanent, as not self. You can still contemplate the mind, of course, but start where it's easiest, where you might get best results. Another question. If someone is ill, can we help them by meditating for their well-being? Definitely, yes. You meditate for the well-being of others, what we might call metta bhavana. You're benefiting for sure, so at least you're benefiting, and maybe it can also help others. Of course, metta is always practiced with some wisdom, so you have to see, well, what's appropriate. If you're living with them as a carer, well, you may still be able to meditate for them at times, but perhaps your primary job is actually caring for them. You have to get the priority right and do the actual practical care first. And when you've got free time, they're resting, whatever, then you may meditate and send your thoughts to them. But you could still do some meditation regularly, because that will help you to be more mindful and at peace within yourself, and learning how to let go of some of your stressful states, negative states, so that the care you give to them may be all the more good quality, and you're more attentive and able to deal with some of the tiredness and the obstacles and the difficulties of caring for someone, say. But I think this question is coming from someone who's separated from their parent, because that's another big thing at the moment, obviously, because of lockdowns and COVID restrictions. Some people are in one state, family are in another, or one country, family are in another, which is unfortunate. One of the unfortunate parts of COVID is that some people have to separate from their loved ones who may be elderly or sick and dying. So there's that feeling of helplessness and disappointment that you can't be with them. So meditation definitely is something you can do. And you may also be able to connect with them online or have conversations and so on, and do what you best from afar to look after them, encourage, work out ways to care for them from afar. But you can also meditate, again, to calm yourself from that anxiety of not being with your loved one. So the anxiety will come up, of course, but not to dwell on it and let it become like a poison that brings your mind a lot of negativity and unnecessary suffering. Develop the metta and focus on the loved one who's ill, and you can do that. Visualize them and send your thoughts of metta every day. And particularly monks and nuns, monastics understand, the more powerful your mind through meditation, the stronger the metta can be in influencing the person. But you need the wisdom also to manage your expectations. If someone is dying, with the strongest metta in the world, you're unlikely to cure them, but you may be able to help boost their state of mind as they're dying, calm them, relax them, bring up more wholesome states for them. And this has been done over and over again, but this is by people who meditate regularly and having a certain strength of mind. So, I could tell you many experiences of monks I know, maybe one Lumpur Cha. There's one old elderly monk who lived with him, who really loved him, but was always getting into trouble. And his worst kind of trouble he got into was one day he was charged by a male deer in the mating season. Its hormones were very stirred up, and it saw him as a competitor, I guess, and charged him, and he had horns, so he gouged his stomach, opened up his stomach. There's a lot of bleeding. And the monk went to hospital, and the doctor sent a message back that the monk was seriously injured. He was elderly and the injuries were extreme. And they sent the message to Lumpur Cha, and nobody could be quite sure what Lumpur Cha did, because these things are private, aren't they? But the monk recovered. To the surprise of the doctors, they thought he would probably die. When he recovered, he could remember, he called it a dream, but it was a dream, and Lumpur Cha coming radiant to see him in this dream, and after that he recovered. So the interpretation is, Lumpur Cha probably spread a lot of metta to him, to help him during that difficult time. So there's many stories like that. Meditators, lay meditators as well, monks as well, spreading metta, sometimes to affect improvements in a person's condition. Often though it's just to help their state of mind. So don't expect miracles from meditating for others, but it certainly can boost our state of mind, calm us, put us in a more wholesome state at a time when we probably feel stressed, anxious, worried. And maybe it can also help the person on the other end that we're sending our metta to. But don't wait until people are dying or ill. Practice your meditation every day. Train now while you're healthy and while your relatives and friends are healthy, so when the day comes, you've got something you can turn to and use. Be prepared. And don't be like those people who, they get to the point where they're dying and they're turning to monks saying, teach me how to meditate. And don't wait that long. Don't be heedless with your life. Learn meditation while you're strong, healthy. Prepare for who knows what. We don't know what life will bring us, do we? We know we will die, we'll get old, we'll get sick and die, for sure. But we don't know when or how. So be prepared. That's what a wise person does. Treat every day as your last day. Practice today, get ready for when the real last day comes. The last question, how do we live or work with other people who bully us or treat us unfairly? It's part of life, isn't it? I guess partly it depends on the context, doesn't it? The situation, there's many degrees of bullying. So then that will determine partly how you respond, how you deal with it. As a practitioner, our number one job is to try and keep our mind in a wholesome state, to bring out mindfulness and all the virtuous qualities, to try and keep the precepts, be mindful, use wise consideration, wise attention to the situation to try and solve it through wisdom and understanding and from a place of mindfulness, patience, restraint, rather than giving into our emotions, which often lead us to make rash decisions or do things that may come back on us. So that's the sort of general teaching, but then it depends on the situation, doesn't it? If everyone needs safety and security, so if it's the worst case, somebody is physically threatening you, if you're in a bad relationship or in a workplace where they're trying to intimidate you physically, sometimes the only solution is get out of there, leave the relationship, leave the job, if it's in the worst case. Why are there so many refugees in the world? Well, a lot of it is because they're in places where they're threatened, so they leave. That's the bottom line. But a lot of bullying is more subtle than that. There's not immediate physical danger, but there's maybe mental, psychological effects, and a lot of it is just annoying, difficult, challenging. So it kind of depends. If it's more on that level, you don't have to physically leave the place maybe, and maybe it's difficult to. Sometimes you just have to be patient. Sometimes you have to look for ways to deal with it. So maybe look for third parties who can help, people who can talk to that person. If we can, sometimes we have to talk to them, but that's not always possible. My first experience of workplace bullying was I was about 16. I got a job. I was washing up in a huge kitchen, the biggest kitchen I've ever seen, like 400 meters long. And I was stationed at one end, and I had 8 hours a day washing up, pots, pans, trays, all that stuff, underground. The air was bad, the working conditions were not good, but I was 16 and I wanted the money. Down the other end was another guy doing exactly the same thing, but he'd been there a lot longer. I was a temporary staff, he was permanent. He'd been there a lot longer and he was older than my dad. So we worked until 4 p.m. officially, but if you finished early, you could go home. So he was always bringing trays on trolleys down to me at 3 o'clock to dump with me so he could go home early. And he always had a really good excuse and reason, and he knew everyone, and I didn't know anything, and he was older than me. So it very quickly became obvious he was just taking advantage. And there was nothing I could do. It was 300 or 400 meters, he was trolleying stuff down to me. If I trolleyed it back and he'd already gone home, it would look bad on me. And the head chef who hired me, he had many things on his mind, I guess you could say, on his plate to do, so he wouldn't have time for this. And this old guy just had all the answers, and he was bullying me, taking advantage of me. But I had one thing, I had already started reading about Buddhism, and I already had a sort of understanding of karma, and I just stuck to that. He's making bad karma. If I give in to my anger, I'll make bad karma, so I'm not going to get angry. There's nothing I can do. I'm just going to use my young body, finish the job as quick as I can and get out of there. And I was only there for a few months, so I just hung on. Sometimes you just have to hang on. And I made sure I didn't argue with him. I wanted to. I tried once and it didn't work, so after that I said, I'm not going to argue with him. I just put up with it and then leave. And I actually developed compassion, because as I say, he's suffering much more than me. He had an old body, not a very good state of mind. He clearly was suffering more than me, so I just felt sorry for him and put up with my own anger and didn't act on it. And in that situation, that seemed to be the simplest and best way to deal with it. You don't usually get bullied as a monk, but occasionally you get a little bit. Like, there's one monastery I went when I was on Tudong. Like, I was a monk. I'd been a monk about 6 years, so I sort of knew the basics. I went to one monastery where they had a community of about 20 and they practiced well, but I had never lived there before, so I was having to learn how they did things, because each monastery does things a little bit differently. There's one monk who has been a monk about the same time as me, but he was from that monastery and he knew everything that should be done, how it should be done, and he could see I was new, I didn't know how to do everything. So for some reason he took a dislike to me and kept picking on me. I don't know, perhaps he thought he was doing the right thing, telling me what to do, but I detected a certain aversion from him. So I just decided again, I've got to be patient with this, not give in to my own anger, because my practice is to restrain my anger. It would come up, but I wouldn't act on it. I just keep my mouth shut, just get on with my practice. I didn't want to make things bad, so I just did that. So there's one day I thought I was doing something really good. I came out to the chores. We had an afternoon chores session, which was sweeping and hauling water from a well. There's no pipe water in those days, and taking it to different places in the monastery. And I thought, oh, today I'm going to do more to help the monastery than usual. I'm going to start my sweeping 1 hour earlier, because there was a lot to sweep, and I'm just going to do it as a gift to the monastery, because I was happy to be there. It was a good teacher and I was very happy. So I'll do my sweeping early and do more. So I started sweeping early, and he walked past and he said, the teacher said you should start your sweeping at 1 p.m. Why are you starting at midday? You're doing it wrong. And I said, the way you do, you just thought, well, I was just trying to do something good. And he stormed off as though I'd done something really bad. So I just let it go and carried on sweeping once he'd gone. And I was thinking, why did he make such a big deal about that? But anyway, I just put up with it. And the next day was what we call Patimokkha Day. Every 2 weeks we have Patimokkha recitation, all the monks come together, and that's something you have to attend. You can't be late and you can't miss it. And in that monastery they started the Patimokkha at dawn. So you had to be there like 6 a.m. or just before, because we confess our offences and then we sit there. And we confessed our offences and we sat there to hear the Patimokkha, and the teacher came in, everyone's there, and it's dawn. There was one monk missing. And who should it be but this monk? So I'm sitting there, and after a while I realised, oh, he's the one that's missing. And the teacher, being very restrained and mindful, just sat there. He didn't say a thing, because he didn't have to, because everyone knew who was missing, and they knew he'd obviously slept in, he was not careful. The teacher didn't say anything, because that was his way of teaching. If he'd complained to the monk when he finally turned out like half an hour late, we just had to sit there for half an hour waiting for him. And there was this sort of rush through the forest, as though there was a bear charging at us or something. It was this monk struggling to get there, and then he did the fastest confession of offences, which is like a little ceremony in Pali that I've ever heard. Blah, 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 blah. He did it like in 1 minute flat. And then he came rushing up and he sat down, he bowed, he sat down, and he didn't dare say anything. And the teacher didn't say a word because he didn't have to, because everyone knew this monk was wrong. Everyone knew he's kept the whole monastery waiting. It was a bad day for him. So even I felt sorry for him. And I was working on restraining that bit of, the little bit of the smile. Now it's his turn to get criticised. But I actually got a good lesson, because the teacher, who could have criticised him and told him, you've got it wrong, you stayed in bed, you lazy monk, he didn't. He just sat there, was completely equanimous, because he didn't need to say anything, because everyone knew what had happened. No words need to be said. I thought, that's a good teaching. When someone bullies you, often that's all you need to do. I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes all you do is wait. And something happens. It comes back on them quite often, especially if you're not giving in to your anger and fighting back and trying to get revenge on them. You just wait and see. Quite often it will come back on them quite naturally. And all you need to do is just watch, and you learn lessons. So there are many ways to deal with bullies, sometimes patience, sometimes communication, sometimes seeking help from others, sometimes run if it's too difficult. So there's no one answer to this. But unfortunately it's part of life. I guess if you go to the top, the gold standard is the Buddha. Right? He had bullies. He had teachers from other sects who were jealous of him, thought he was wrong, would be picking on him, criticising. Most of the time he'd just be patient. Quite often he'd be silent. Sometimes he'd actually talk to them with kindness and skill and even convert them, a few. Sometimes they wouldn't listen, so he just had to bear with it. Who was the worst? And the worst is Devadatta, his own cousin. He just spent years getting at him, causing every kind of trouble to the Buddha, physically trying to harm him, even kill him, trying to turn monks against him, turn the king against him, every kind of trouble. And even Devadatta at the very end admitted, he said, wow, I've given you every kind of trouble, and every time you've responded with kindness, compassion, and treated me like your brother. So that's the gold standard, treat them with forgiveness, compassion. If they're bullying you, ultimately that's their problem, their bad karma, they're going to suffer for it. Your job, number one job, is look after your mind, don't give in to your own negativity. It'll come up for sure, but don't feed it, don't dwell on it, let it go. So maybe I'll finish there tonight. These questions are very big subjects, but just giving some pointers on them. Hope that's useful for you.